In September 2020, I uploaded a video on one of the most interesting cars from a mechanical perspective in automotive history. Due to its relative obscurity, however, I didn't expect many people to actually watch that video. But fortunately for me, over 130,000 of you saddos have done. So today on TwinCam, we're going to look at that car's successor, the Volvo 300 series. If you're not a regular follower of my channel, the car I was referring to was the DAF 66, a compact family car built in the Netherlands by DAF, the company much better known for its trucks. But the 66 was far from yet another European small car from the early 1970s, as DAF always distanced themselves completely from the mainstream through their engineering. At the 66's rear was what they termed Variomatic, alongside De Dion suspension, making what appeared to be a conservative small family car into something of a technological tour de force. Soon after the launch of the 66, DAF were looking for a funding partner, and one of the companies that showed interest was Volvo. Now, to understand why, we need to look at the political climate of the early 1970s. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out, fought between Israel and a coalition of Arab states. This conflict almost instantly began to directly affect European nations, as the oil-producing Arab states began a blockade on any country that supported Israel, leading to an oil crisis. As a result, consumers turned towards smaller, more economical cars, but Volvo didn't make anything of the sort. In fact, the Swedish company only had one model line, the newly introduced 200 series, a car you wouldn't describe as small or economical. This was the primary reason that Volvo bought DAF, as a way to access the compact market without developing an all-new car from scratch. Additionally, DAF had access to Renault engines and, as they were from the Netherlands, had direct access to the European single market, something Volvo wanted a bigger slice of. Similarly, DAF was actively hunting for a partner. It wanted to increase its market share across Europe and thought it might be able to do so by making the 66's replacement a slightly larger car, as well as pooling its marketing and technical skills. The deal saw Volvo take a third of DAF's shares in 1973, then seize a controlling stake 2 years later. Immediately afterwards, DAF was integrated into Volvo proper, with the 66 gaining Swedish badges. But the main attraction for both parties was the car DAF had been working on since the turn of the decade. This new car is what became the Volvo 343, launched in February 1976. Though before the Swedes had any influence at all, it was slated to be launched as the DAF 77. And this gold car we have here is as close to a DAF as you can get. In contrast, this green car is a 1981 Volvo 345 with 5 doors, as became available in 1979. It also has much more Volvo-ness than the gold car, so with these two examples today, we can begin to understand how Volvo made this car closer to being a proper Volvo. But first, let's see what kind of engineering wonders the Dutch were getting on with. Mechanically, everything in the gold car comes from DAF, but under the bonnet of both of these cars is the same Renault-sourced Cléon Font engine that you'd find in the 66, and that Renault would use all the way through to the original Twingo. It has an iron block, aluminium cylinder head, overhead valves and a single carburettor, but for the 300 series it was enlarged up to 1400cc and producing about 70 brake horsepower. For the first few years, this was the only engine you could get, but as we'll come to a few times during this video, Volvo later began to really put their own print on this car. They plonked in their own 2-litre red block engine, badging it up as the Volvo 360. This car produced 95 horsepower with a carburettor or 115 with fuel injection, and that's proper hot hatch territory. Later on, there was also a 1700cc Renault engine and a 1600 diesel, but at the beginning, things still seemed very DAF-like. In fact, the rear end is virtually identical to the old 66. At the end of the prop shaft is the Variomatic system itself. This is the single engineering feature that made DAF cars unique, and the 300 series even has an exotic rear suspension as well. Before Volvo's takeover, DAF saw Variomatic as such a big part of their cars' identities that they continuously refer to it in marketing material, and it became the primary reason for their customers' choice in car. This system is what we know today as a continuously variable transmission, and in this form it's all exposed out at the back in front of the rear axle. So if you look under a DAF, you can see the rubber belts and pulleys that allow the variable ratios. As with any comparable transmission, Variomatic has the ability to select an infinite number of gear ratios, aiding acceleration and efficiency. But the fact that it's located at the rear gives the 300 series its most lauded characteristic, an almost perfect weight distribution. However, Variomatic wasn't to everyone's liking. As anyone will tell you, people don't like change, and certainly don't like things they don't understand. For most people, the idea of an elastic transmission wasn't a welcome one. People found its characteristics unnerving and doubted its reliability, despite DAF taking their older cars rallying in order to prove its dependability. Couple that to the fact that Europeans never really liked automatic transmissions, and you can see why Volvo pulled DAF away from their precious transmissions. At the time the Gold car was produced, the only transmission available was Variomatic, but by the time this green car was produced, Volvo had developed a 4-speed manual. Still mounted at the back, like a Porsche, but that was one step towards being more conventional, and as a result, it massively expanded the car's customer base. But back to the main attraction, the Variomatic system is a full transaxle, with CVs taking the drive to the wheels. This rear end is suspended on leaf springs by a De Dion tube, a very sophisticated form of non-independent suspension that ensures the camber angles of the wheels are always kept constant. It's the same setup used in cars like the Rover P6 and a fair few Alfa Romeos, as well as sports cars such as the Caterham 7 and Aston Martins for a couple of decades. Although we all know leaves are not the best springing mechanism, the rear transaxle and De Dion tube layout created a balance that would endear the 300 series to motorsport further down the line. But back to the design stage, and before Volvo had any direct involvement, 4 styling proposals were presented to DAF. 2 in-house proposals, one from Bertoni and one from Michelotti, who'd also done the 66 that hadn't yet been launched. The Victor was one of the in-house designs by John de Vries, and his shape was radically different from anything DAF had made before. The 66's shape was recognisably from the late 60s, and recognisably Italian as well, sharing a lot with other Michelotti penned cars such as the Triumph Dolomite. But de Vries' lines were all straight, all functional and very conservative. Volvo themselves weren't completely convinced by DAF's styling efforts, but the car was so close to completion that it had to go on virtually as it was, barring a bit of Volvo-ness in things like the grille, the rear lamps and the bumpers. But I don't think anyone would describe this shape as particularly good looking. The proportions are fine, and it's a rare case of the later 5-door car looking better than the 3-door, but even then it's still not all that to the eye. It's exceptionally plain from the side on, not helped on the earlier car by the non-wraparound bumpers. The only things worth talking about are the vent in the C-pillar and kick-up in the rear window. From the front, the nose cone is awkward and seems cobbled together from bits they had lying around. One thing that is worth noting though, just for engineering's sake, are these vents in the front bumper. On the Variomatic car they're real, but they're blanked off in the manual car. Their function is to cool the Variomatic system, channeling air all the way through the chassis to just in front of the pulleys. The rear of the car is even plainer, and in 1976 it was a bit off-canter thanks to the notchback shape. Fortunately for Volvo, this choice would age very well, helped by cars like the Ford Escort adopting a notchback hatchback for 1980. I must admit though that I've just been slightly mean to the 300. It's not ugly at all, it's just a bit plain and anonymous. However, on these pre-facelift models, the slightly racier specifications you could get in some markets, such as the R-Sport, cured this with cool alloy wheels, rather loud decals, a little lip spoiler at the back, and a deep and racy front bumper. Some cars, when treated to these kind of modifications, can look a bit silly, like the Allegro Keep. But the 300 series pulls it off brilliantly, and somehow becomes, in one fell swoop, really quite cool. But in period, that wasn't the car's target market, and for a more conservative buyer, the gradual changes Volvo made transformed it into a really smart family car. The biggest change was out front, as they finally fitted an acceptable mid-80s appearance, with a grille and headlamps that fitted together properly, with a sharp integrated bonnet line and the obligatory headlamp wipers as standard. As I'm sure you'll all be convinced by now, these cars are much more daft than they are Volvo, but thanks to a bit of foresight from DAF's engineers and a little bit of Volvo intervention in the engineering stage, the 300 is just as safe as you'd expect a Volvo to be. This is a cheap car, launched in 1976 with rather poor fit and finish. But it has a padded dashboard, soft materials, crumple zones, side impact and rollover protection, head restraints and rear seat belts. That does mean that for the late 70s it is quite heavy, but for the benefits it gave the car, it was more than worth the additions. But I have to be clear that I say benefits, plural, because the safety aspect was complemented by the marketing department.
The Volvo 340, tested by dummies, driven by the intelligent.
When we step inside, however, those mechanical features begin to rear their uglier side. When the old 66 was introduced, most cars were still rear-wheel drive. But by the time the 300 series was really coming into its own, most cars had switched over to being front-wheel drive. Joining the existing Renaults, Austins, Fiats and Citroens were the incredibly popular Opel Kadett in 1979 and Ford Escort in 1980. The packaging improvements presented by a front drive layout meant that only within a few years the 300 series felt quite cramped thanks to the massive transmission tunnel. Similarly, the boot has quite a shallow floor thanks to the rear-mounted transmission and the De Dion tube, but it is still quite large overall thanks to just the shape of the car. But the other thing that's worth noting here is the fact that it's a hatchback anyway. The old 66 was a saloon, as was pretty much everything else when that car was launched. But by 1976, quite a few manufacturers, mainly Renault and Volkswagen, had fitted their mainstream family cars with hatchbacks. So DAF were right on the money by making this new car a hatchback. Volvo did later do a saloon, for those who were suspicious of practicality. But coming back into the interior of these cars are the best place to see how much Volvo actually changed. In the Gold car, virtually everything is from DAF. The seats, for example, are the same as you'd see in a 66. The steering wheel is the same as a 66. All the switchgear is the same as a 66. This interior is actually almost identical to the old 66, and so would be very familiar to anyone who's watched my video on it. But with it being such an early car, That means that we can see exactly why Volvo did feel the need to start changing things. Though it might look quite nice, the build quality and fit and finish are just horrendous. The dashboard doesn't really fit into the car very well. Look at the lines between the glove box and the dash, for example. None of the lines in the moulding even are remotely straight. It's just a poorly designed car to start with, which is a massive shame. This brown plastic that this one's made out of as well discolours really badly. Look at the steering wheel and the column shroud behind it. They've all discoloured really badly. This upholstery has just been retrimmed, and though it is absolutely lovely, the original had all split and discoloured really badly. And finally, take these air vents. They're like the tray in an advent calendar, only more brittle. In fact, the quality is so poor in these early cars that Volvo grew anxious that their hard-earned reputation for quality, reliability and dependability was going to fade away. In the UK, whenever an early 300 series was traded into a Volvo dealership, they just scrapped the car. And apparently any owner of an early car was offered a free upgrade to a later 300 series. By the time of the green car, however, just enough has been changed to make it feel like a proper Volvo. For example, we have Volvo seats, we have Volvo style instruments and Volvo style heater controls. The quality still isn't quite all there, but they have addressed the really fundamental issues. So like the air vents, for example, are no longer the horrendous type in the older car. It does still feel like a cheap family car, which, to be fair, is what it is. But it feels so much better considered in both its design and construction than the early car. But an end to talking about build quality and how it kind of feels like that car's going to fall apart when I touch anything, and towards the actual fundamentals of sitting in a car and driving it. Although the DAF seats are really quite cool, I love the material and the style, these seats are much comfier than the original seats, and you can tell in that way that they are Volvo. The head restraints are hard, but I suppose how often are you putting your head back when you're driving? Not a lot. Due to the fact that there is a huge transmission tunnel and this is a relatively small family car, there is no place to put your left foot, but we do of course get the manual gearbox. I suppose the car wouldn't have been designed with a footrest because there wasn't a clutch pedal when DAF were designing the car. The clutch is relatively light and the gear change is absolutely fantastic, to be fair to it. Apparently second gear can be a little bit difficult in practice, but it just clicks so nicely into each gear. It's a very positive gear change, and that's unusual for a car from this kind of era. The driving position itself isn't anything to really write home about, but it does feel quite commanding. There are some cars from the 1970s where you feel like you're having to kind of alter where you sit in the car to drive it properly. Whereas this, nothing is perfect, but everything is just kind of there and it just kind of works. But the fact that Volvo changed so much in here is really astonishing, as DAF had clearly fully developed the 77. It was ready to go on sale, and it did, just with Volvo badges. But by 1978, only the kind of second full model year really, everything had changed in the interior. This dashboard isn't just a modified version of that in the older car with some better materials and with a bit more consideration gone into its production, but everything is different. Every single item of switchgear, from the stalks to where the radio sits to the buttons like the hazard warning light down here to all the light controls down here, they are all completely different to those in the older car. I thought we'd sit in the back of the green car because frankly it's a bit easier to get in and out of. And in the back of this car is quite a nice place to be really, because it is actually a bit of a bigger car than I ever kind of perceive it is. I always perceive it as being slightly smaller than an Escort or an Astra or something like that, but it actually is that size. But the seat back, quite unusually for a car of this era, is very, very reclined. You sit quite relaxed in the back, whereas, to be fair, a lot of cars of this era, you sit quite upright just on a bench, whereas these seats are actually sculpted, which is lovely. The legroom is just about right, really. Of course, for the central passenger in the back, there's the huge transmission tunnel, so that's not brilliant, but there is just enough room for me in here on my own for some knees, and there's loads of space under the front seat for some foot room. You do get grab handles, but they're really far forwards, so it would make much more sense for them to be here, but no, they're all the way forwards there. Because the roofline doesn't slope away as well, you get quite a lot of headroom, and the roof actually continues quite far back before the rear screen starts going. So that means that there's a huge parcel shelf behind you where you could put some bits and bobs on, though that's not actually the most supportive of parcel shelves, but it makes the back of this car feel really quite big. But jumping back to the early days for a second, when there was only a 3-door 300 series available, and DAF cars all had this little trick with the seats in order to enable just that little bit more room for you getting into the back. No other car company seems to have ever done anything like this, but the seats do genuinely hit each other when you fold them forwards. What I don't have here to show you today is a later car, which has a completely different dashboard again, and features the biggest step forwards into making this go from having the finish of a typical late 70s car to having a bang up to date, well designed and well constructed interior. And it's all these changes that play the biggest role in the 300 series growing into one of Volvo's unintended greatest hits. It took until December 1983, nearly 8 years after the 300's introduction, for them to produce 100,000 cars. But once the range was expanded with different engines, a manual gearbox and 5 doors, as well as the car generally improving with continued updates, it grew more and more popular. Only 5 years later, in 1988, they built the millionth Volvo 300. It's exceptionally rare for a car to grow in popularity so rapidly so long after its introduction. But once people realised how good these cars had become, it became Volvo's most popular model in the UK and was regularly in the UK's top 10 bestsellers. But you can't be surprised at that, as by that point it was cheaper than a Maestro or an Escort, despite being very expensive earlier on. Let us also bear something in mind here. The Volvo 300 series is actually the same age as the Mark II Ford Escort. There's a serious gulf between those two cars, and can you imagine Ford still marketing the Mark II Escort going into the 90s? There is something else that joins those two cars, however, and it's motorsport. The Mark II Escort was incredibly popular in the UK, and in period they were used for racing and rallying quite extensively, meaning they're still a fixture of rally stages today, and possibly the go-to rear-drive rally car. For the 300 series, the motorsport thing took a little longer for people to cotton on to. But as opposed to its reputation for an elderly clientele in the 1980s, the average current Volvo 300 owner is usually a lot younger, has stiffened up the suspension, lowered it significantly, fitted fat wheels, and goes everywhere sideways. It took a few decades, but that rear-mounted transmission has made the 300 an affordable racing car. That means that this little Dutch car has one of the most extraordinary stories that I've ever featured on this channel. At its launch, it was masquerading as a good car. It was underpowered, unrefined, thirsty, pig-nosed, badly built, and frankly no one wanted one. But 10 years later, it had been transformed into a conservative but sharply styled car. It was well built, it was quite fast, and it was one of the best-selling cars in Britain. And now 30 years on from that, and it's become the darling of the drift scene. I don't know of a single car that's had such an enrichment. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.